I think actually it's absolutely a perfect segue now after a lovely lunch, I hope. I hope you had time to walk outside. To go from the dilemmas that we face in museums that host paintings with strong Christian iconography to a museum of the Bible, which presumably has nailed its colors to the mast in that sense. I worry when I get those comments that Brera is a religious museum, but I don't think a museum of the Bible should worry. In fact, you should probably be very happy if you're known as a museum of Christianity. So I will immediately pass the word to Alan Quine, who I believe is the director of the Bible Museum. No?
No, Vice President of International Relations.
Okay, sorry, got the title wrong, didn't do my homework. But nonetheless,
Great.
Welcome, and we're looking forward to listening.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. And again, as all have thanked Monsignor Verdin for this privilege and opportunity to be here this weekend, or for this symposium, thank you, and all the work that's been done for this to happen. I have the privilege of speaking after lunch, which is always a wonderful slot to get, and so I'll try to be unusually interesting as opposed to when I usually talk. Instead of going down the road of my paper, I want to, what we call in America, call an audible. Comes from football, where the quarterback goes behind his team, American football, and changes the play based on the situation. So I'm going to change the play just a little bit based on the situation, talk a little more philosophically and psychologically and even somewhat theologically. But just to correct our understanding, the Museum of the Bible is not necessarily a Christian organization. It's a secular organization, if you will, non-sectarian. We're just about the Bible. We're not about Baptists or Presbyterians or Methodists or Jewish or Orthodox. We're just about the Bible, and we're just presenting the Bible, and I'll go through our mission statement here in a moment. Allow me to share with you an anecdote. 21 years ago, my wife and I made a decision that many couples have made mistakenly in their marriage. We decided to have children. And after 7 weeks or 8 weeks of pregnancy, my wife and I went to the technician for the sonogram to inspect the condition of the child and look for the heartbeat. And we're there with the technician, and we're looking at the screen. And the technician, she says, "Oh, look at there. Do you see that?" And of course, if you've had that experience, I don't understand anything on the screen. And so we said no, and the technician, she said, "Well, here's the chorionic sac and the amniotic sac, and right there you have two babies looking at each other. They're identical twins." And so we thought that was very funny. We got into the elevator afterwards. We rode down together. My wife was teaching, and I was engaged in the college and the university where I was teaching. And we went our separate ways. We came home together. We laughed. We thought it was wonderful. Some 8 months later, they were born. It ceased to be wonderful. With two of them crying, with colic, fussing. You couldn't share, you get up, it's your turn. No, we both had to get up all the time. It was nightmarish. I will never forget it. And finally, they were 2 years old. Things were more stable. My wife and I made a second mistake. She became pregnant again. And this time I'm taking care of the boys, the identical twin boys, and my wife goes to the sonogram experience by herself. She calls me on the way home, and she is crying on the phone. And I thought, oh no, what's the matter? So I asked her, what's the matter? And I'm thinking the baby's in distress, or worse, the baby's dead. And she says, twins. And I said, the boys are fine. What's the matter? She says, no, we're having twins again. So the girls were born, and it was an experience beyond anything I had ever experienced before or could prepare for. It was a metaphysic that I was not accustomed to. And so I thought, how do I get help for this? And so I called Mom. I called my mother, and as the phone rang, I realized this is a mistake. Do I really want my kids to turn out like me? And so I quickly hung up. And then I thought about calling my mother-in-law. That thought quickly passed. But when the girls became about 2 years old, things got settled, and we went into a rhythm where it was an absolute marvelous experience. But I realized I was facing something that was beyond my experience, beyond any metaphysical experience I had had in the past. I was facing something that was beyond philosophy, beyond my reason, beyond my intellect, and I had to throw up my hands in abject faith and say, God, help me. And so we responded to this crisis, this challenge, by faith. No experience would help us. No reason or logic would help us. We were walking the road of faith. And so the Museum of the Bible, while we draw upon experience and we draw upon philosophy and reason, we hope that our constituents, our visitors, will engage what we present not only with their experience and background and with their logic and minds, but with a modicum of faith, that they'll come with some understanding of faith and that we are faith-based beings to some degree. Here is our museum in Washington, D.C. It is about a block and a half from the mall, the main mall on the south side, a little bit behind the Smithsonian. Almost directly across the mall from where we are is the Lincoln Monument. And so if you know Washington, D.C. at all, you have a sense of where we are. This building is 430,000 square feet, or about 40,000 square meters, 6 stories high, but every story is actually 2 stories. It was a 12-story building, and so we can get in large items, and you have the expanse of every floor being 2 stories high. It was a cold storage building in the early 20th century, in about 1910, where the train drove into those bronze doors you see at that end, and so it was built, very solid building, and so to remodel this building was an extreme challenge, but a very solid, very stable building for any artifacts or items that we might care to bring in. It's a common story, but it's a story from the Bible, the story of Moses. And after Moses killed the Egyptian, he ran into the desert to live for 40 years, and he worked for his then became father-in-law for 40 years. One day he's with the flock in the desert, and as he's watching the flock, he sees up on the horizon, on the hillside, a bush that was on fire, a burning bush. You know the story. And as he looked at the bush, he said, perhaps out loud, or said to himself, I need to go look at this. While the bush is engulfed in flames, it's not being consumed by the flames. It just keeps burning. And so as he approached this bush, he heard a voice. Moses, take off your shoes, for the space you are standing is sacred. And so he bent over, took off his shoes, and immediately he is engaged in the exhibit. He is an active participant in the exhibit. And as he continued to stand there, he received this instruction from the voice from God himself. I want you to go to Pharaoh. I've heard the cry of my people. Tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And of course, Moses objected, because now he is engaging a metaphysic that he's never seen before, a reality that he's never experienced before, a bush that's burning, a voice from heaven. And these things make no sense to him. Not only can he not draw upon his past experience, he can't call mom, but it doesn't make any sense to him. His mind can't filter out. It's not logical that this would all take place. And so he needs to step in the shoes of faith as he puts his sandals back on, ultimately, and do this by faith. He also argues with the voice, argues with God. And finally, his argument rests with this proposition. What if the people ask me who you are? What's your name? What God are you? And God says, my name is I am, the first person singular verb. My name is I am. Makes no sense. And so he leaves the exhibit of the bush and the Sinai Museum with this thought in his mind of a metaphysic that's beyond his experience from the past, something that isn't so logical, and now he's wrestling with the proposition of God's name being the first person singular verb, I am. That's what the Museum of the Bible is really all about. Our mission statement says this: we invite all people to engage in the history, the narrative, and the impact of the Bible. Notice, we invite all people. We're not inviting only Christians. We're not inviting only Jewish-oriented folks. We're not inviting Orthodox merely. We're inviting all people because we believe the Bible is all-encompassing for all people. After all, it communicates all are created in the image of God, wherever you're from, whatever your economic background, your racial background, your national background. We're inviting all people to engage in three things: the history, the narrative, and the impact of the Bible. But what does it mean to engage our exhibits? What does it mean to engage your exhibit, your exhibits, your museum? And so we wrestle with this word. Notice, it's not merely we invite all people to look at the Bible as if it's a static instrument. It's not merely we invite all people to learn about the Bible, although those things, that is important. We're not inviting all people to argue theology about the Bible. That's not what we're about. We're just stating we want people to engage the Bible, to engage the Bible. Here is the entryway of our museum. Again, the ceiling is 2 stories high. This is a 140-foot LCD panel. So as you walk into the museum, our hope was that you would say, our visitors would say, wow. And so we can put on this screen, this LCD panel, any image we want from an exhibit, any picture from a piece of art or an artifact or a document, a piece of parchment, or just a beautiful picture like my 4 children, which has never happened yet. As you go through the exhibit on the first floor, we are concerned, as we've heard previously this morning, we're concerned about the next generation, that they can engage the Bible as well. And so we created this space for children 10 and under to come and to play with stories of the Bible, with ideas that would engage them at their level with the Bible. This is incredibly popular, this space on the first floor where parents can drop their children off and they play with toys, they play with artifacts, make-believe artifacts, and they engage the Bible at their level. Then you come to the history of the Bible floor, an entire floor, some 10,000 square feet, dedicated to the history of the Bible. Where did the Bible come from? And so it begins with other documents from the ancient Near East, other tablets, such as the Code of Hammurabi, or a simile of the Code of Hammurabi. So people realize that the Law of Moses is not an isolated event, but is part of the cultural milieu of the time. And so our visitors start to learn the process of how the Bible came about. And as you go through this archway, you see the Dead Sea Scroll fragments. And as you continue to go forward through this exhibit, you have the New Testament parchments and the vellum where the New Testament was written. And then you go on to the collection and the putting together the early books that were copied by hand, and then the printing press. And on you go through ultimately translations that are taking place even today about the history of the Bible, how the Bible is put together and how it's communicated today. Some months ago, I was walking through this exhibit just to take another look, and there was a young couple, a millennial couple, in their early 20s, with a glazed look over their eyes, looking at the parchments from the New Testament, having gone through our Dead Sea Scroll fragments and the multiplicity of those fragments. And I put myself in their shoes for a moment, and I realized here they're looking at fragments that they can't read, that they don't understand, that they can't appreciate, and we have committed a sin that no museum should ever commit. We have caused our visitor the sin of boredom. They were bored. And so I engaged the visitor. And I walked up to them and I said, "May I speak with you for a moment?" Now the young woman was carrying a Bible. And so I asked if I could speak with them. They looked at my name tag and they said, "Well, yes, that would be great." And I turned to this item. This is an item called P0220. It's the Wyman fragment, the Lehman-Wyman fragment. This fragment is from the end of Romans chapter 4, the beginning of Romans chapter 5. And I pointed to this item and I said, this item comes from Romans chapter 4, beginning of Romans chapter 5. And it says this in Romans chapter 5. "Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God." And they looked at the item, and I said, it summarizes the book of Romans, if not the entire Bible itself, with that one verse. And this is the earliest existing fragment of that verse. "Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God." It says, therefore it's drawing a conclusion from what it said, what the book of Romans says in the previous verses, and then it's going forward with a thought, and it acts like a hinge between what took place in the previous verses and what's coming up in the subsequent verses. Therefore, having been justified, having been something that took place in the past and is finished, the past perfect tense, and the word justified is actually a legal word. It's a forensic word which means to be declared not guilty. Therefore, having been declared not guilty or justified by faith, not by our experience, not by our intellect or reasoning ability, but by this thing called faith. Having been justified by faith, we have peace with God. This fragment is older than Codex Vaticanus, which is a early 4th century document. This comes from the 3rd century, middle to late 3rd century. Codex Vaticanus says the same thing. In fact, every manuscript thereafter says the same thing. Having been justified by faith, we have peace with God, except this doesn't say that. Instead, it says this: "Therefore, having been justified by faith, we should have peace with God." It's in the subjunctive rather than the indicative. We should have peace with God. But Codex Vaticanus and everything thereafter says it in the indicative as a statement of fact. We have peace with God. Now, I said to this couple, you now think of yourselves as the biblical scholars. You're wrestling with this text, the earliest representation of this passage, one of the earliest representations of the entire book of Romans. Which way are you going to go with it? Is it you should have peace with God, or that you have peace with God? Both might be true, but the author only wrote one, not the other. Now, which is it? I see you have a Bible. What's the context of this? What's the concept? What's the author writing about? If it's the Apostle Paul, what's he discussing at this point in the book of Romans? And now they are forced to, like a scholar, engage the Bible. Not merely look at an artifact, and observe it and go on to the next boring fragment in their minds. But now they have to engage the fragment and look at it. And so our signage tries to point people that direction, that they actually engage what they're looking at every exhibit. That's the history floor. The narrative floor, the next floor down, where now that you know where the Bible came from, the history floor, now what does the Bible say? And again, we try to engage our visitors. We actually have not just items of narrative, but you actually walk through the experience of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible. And so we contracted with a group out of Hollywood, out of California, to help our visitors walk through the Exodus, walk through the conquering of the land, walk through Joshua, Judges, Ruth, walk through the Old Testament, to actually engage it and experience it in a visual exhibit. And then they go to a theater where they sit and listen to the rest of the story told by the Apostle John, who's writing the book of Revelation, of what happened next after the ascension of Jesus, so that they can engage the Bible as well. And on this floor between the two is an exhibit of Nazareth in the first century. What was that village like? Why did Jesus use the metaphors he used, or the apostles write in such a way? And so they engage Nazareth to relate back to the Bible, because we're the museum of the Bible. Then they go on to the impact floor. So how was the Bible put together? What does the Bible say? What effect did the Bible have? What's the impact of the Bible? And so we have some 32 mini exhibits showing the impact of the Bible in art, in literature, in music. Anyone ever hear of the musician Elvis Presley? Of course. We have an exhibit about the impact of the Bible on Elvis Presley's music. In fact, we have Elvis Presley's Bible, which is fascinating because you open it up to the book of Psalms, and he has notes written in it that he engaged the Bible himself, and it impacted his life, heart, and soul, that influenced his music. At the end of this long exhibit of these 32 mini exhibits is this station. Off to the left here, this is the impact of the Bible on language. Some of our common vernacular, like the Good Samaritan comes from the Bible. All kinds of statements and phrases that come from the Bible that surprise people. And our goal is that they will come to the museum with certain understanding about areas of their lives or areas of culture and society, and they'll look at our exhibits and say, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that came from the Bible. And then they go into this room on the right where they get a chance to sit in that booth in the middle and tell their story of how the Bible perhaps has impacted their life. And we store their story. They have 2 minutes. We store their story on big data so that their children can come and listen to what they said years ago, or their grandchildren or great-grandchildren can come and listen. And so now they can record their own story about how the Bible has impacted their lives. And they're engaging the Bible. You've heard of the golden rule, of course. The golden rule is not the rule that says, he who has the gold makes the rules. But the golden rule is, of course, this: treat others the way you would like to be treated. Treat others the way you would like to be treated. Or restated, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This comes from the Bible. The words of Jesus. It comes from Luke chapter 6, for instance. And it is something that we're very familiar with and is an ethic that many of us live by and try to strive by. And so I had a group of federal judges that I gave a tour for some time ago, and I challenged them with the golden rule, and I said, can the words of Jesus be improved? And if so, let's call it the platinum rule. Not just the golden rule, but something perhaps more costly in our day and age, the platinum rule. So how would you fill this in? Treat others the way, or this, do unto others. How would you fill in the blank to enhance or perhaps change or give Jesus' words more impact on our lives and hearts today? Do unto others, and one of the spouses of one of the judges said, do unto others before they do it to you. I said, well, that's one way of looking at it. But is there something more inspiring that we could come up with? Do unto others, or treat others the way. How would you fill in the blank? And that very question now has caused you to engage the Bible in the history, in the narrative, and the impact, perhaps even in your life, how to engage the Bible. Again, thank you. It's a privilege to be here. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Two thoughts spring to mind. One is actually, I'll give not my answer to that question, but in fact Bernard Shaw's. George Bernard Shaw, and actually this resonates with something we were saying this morning about giving people space. He said, actually, it should be the other way around. Do not unto others as you would they do unto you. Their taste may not be the same. He, in fact, inverted it. But your talk actually made me think a lot about the power of narrative, which we've been talking about as well, the power of storytelling, the power of re-engaging, because even our identity is often stories we tell to ourselves about ourselves. I mean, when people ask me, what is your identity? And they say, oh, you're a Canadian. I say, well, what does it mean to be a Canadian or be an Italian or be an identity? And it's largely about the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Canadians aren't Americans. The most important thing for any Canadian is to make sure that people understand that they're not American, for instance. This is part of our identity. It's not true or false. It's just a story we have to tell to ourselves repeatedly in order to not be something, to have an edge. Because as, again, Reggio Emilia often stressed, Carlo Rinaldi often said that the border is the place of encounter. Globalization, in fact, is terrible because it eliminates, it suggests that everybody's all the same all the time, where we meet people at the edges of where we are. Nobody has an accent at home. Yeah, nobody. Whether you're from Northern England, whether you're from Connecticut, whether you're from... You don't have an accent when you're at home. You have an accent when you encounter the other, when you encounter someone who doesn't speak quite like you. You only have an accent where it measures distance. It can measure social distance, measure geographical distance, but it's about having an edge that says, now it's not me, that's not us anymore. And then our moral dilemma, our moral issue is, how do you deal with that? Do you embrace it? Do you welcome it? Do you learn those stories? Or do you reject it? And I think we're all very clear here today, the recurring message is that we cannot build walls and we cannot reject that. We have to understand that that's one of the most fruitful places in which we can be ourselves, is at the borders, where we start having an accent. Finally, it made me think that the Bible is an incredibly generative text. I mean, when you think of what it has given rise to, what artists have created from it. Second, perhaps there are other creative texts. Texts have always been used. You spoke, Timothy, about ekphrasis, the notion of using words to describe pictures. The other text, of course, that informs the Renaissance is Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is has this tremendous narrative power that tells us about changes and becoming the other and how the other can both enrich and deceive. Anyway, on that note, I want to, where is Eike? Eike, where are you? There you are. Okay, you're going to speak about something very close to my heart. I lecture often about the museum as a performing art, about the need to re-perform our works, to make them, bring them back to the present. And from your paper, I think you're going to be sailing in that lovely channel. So, good to see you.
Good to see you, James.
I don't have to introduce Eike.
No. We saved some time. It's very good, so I can read a little slower because this is about theory, so I will actually read, which I normally don't. Ladies and gentlemen, on June the 26th, 1784, Friedrich Schiller, at the time a 25-year-old medical doctor who 2 years earlier had caused a sensation directing his own play, Die Räuber, which is generally translated as The Robbers, although actually it would be more correctly be titled The Gangsters, because it's about morality in a group of gangsters. He spoke at the National Theatre in Mannheim and delivered a lecture before the German Society there on the subject Vom Wirken der Schaubühne auf das Volk, or on the theatre's effect on the people. This is the National Theatre in Mannheim. This text, which was printed in 1785 as Was kann eine gute stehende Schaubühne eigentlich wirken? Or what may a good permanent theatre actually achieve? And from 1802 on, repeatedly was reprinted under its final title, Die Schaubühne als eine moralische Anstalt betrachtet, or the theater considered as a moral institution, which also solves the enigma why I had such a strange title of my talk, is not just of interest as a pathological self-reflection, but even more so as a program for the establishment of the permanent theaters as public institutions dedicated to cognitive, emotional, and ethical improvement of mankind according to the ideals of the Enlightenment. These were, of course, the very same ideals which led to the foundation of the British Museum in 1753, and when it eventually opened in 1759, as you all know, it was very, very small, and for its first decades, mostly a library rather than a museum, and especially to the transformation of the vast princely collections of the Uffizi into a public museum devoted to research and education from 1769. Surprisingly, however, Schiller's thorough consideration of the role of the theatre, and indeed of the arts at large, has neither played a role in the development of the theatre's sister institution in the 18th and 19th century, nor has it been considered within the many recent attempts to justify, promote, question, or realign the mission, meaning, and methods of today's museums either. Yet Schiller's treatise turns out to be of great relevance to concerns which are incessantly raised in our own time about the institution which is the subject of this conference. Schiller starts his reasonings with Johann Georg Sulz's psychological explanation of the origin of the theatre out of the human drive to be active, in German, the Trieb nach Tätigkeit, and his urge for the new and the extraordinary, the Hang nach dem Neuen und Außerordentlichen, his desire to sense himself in a state of passion, das Verlangen, sich in einem leidenschaftlichen Zustande zu fühlen, while at the same time mankind is too easily exhausted by abstract and professionally specialized mental work. The sense of beauty mediates between the physical and the spiritual nature of man. According to Schiller, in fact, the theatre unites intellectual and emotional education, die Bildung des Verstandes und des Herzens, with the noblest of entertainment, mit der edelsten Unterhaltung. This claim clearly references the archetypical mission statement of any artistic enterprise, whether institutional or indeed, as it was first understood, individual, which is Horace's Epistula ad Pisones, especially the two hexameters, aut prodesse volunt, aut delectare poete, aut simul etiucund, et idonia dicere vitae, which distinguishes useful from entertaining poetry as a thesis and its antithesis, just to come up with a third kind, a synthesis that for the first time proposes something which nowadays is frequently referred to as edutainment, although Horace would have hardly appreciated this linguistic hybrid akin to the humano capiti cervicem equinam jungere of his opening lines, of course. In the context of Florentine museology, it also recalls the second of the three functions which Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici ascribed to the Florentine art collections in the family agreement, the Patto di Famiglia with Francesco Stefano of Habsburg-Lorraine on October the 31st, 1737, which famously reads, e per ornamento dello Stato, e per utilità del pubblico, e per attirare la curiosità dei forestieri, that is, as an ornament of state, for the public's utility. Well, this is actually the wrong slide, and it doesn't even go. Here we are with the ornament of the state, the public's utility, which is missing here in the slide, anyway, and in order to attract the interest of the foreigners, which you see here. Having established the theatre as an intermediator at the threshold between the animal state of mankind and its specialized intellectual efforts, Schiller compares the dramatic art with religion and law, two other institutions which he considers fundamental to the state. In particular, he sees numerous parallels between theatre and religion for the narrative elements and positive propositional examples contrasting both with law for its limiting and prohibiting character. According to the poet, laws only hamper the dissolution of society, but religion positively fosters and internalizes social cohesion. Law only concerns our external deeds, but religion, according to Schiller, addresses the internal sources of our actions. However, religion, according to Schiller, is effective only for that part of the population which actually believes in its imagery. Another part of society, and for Schiller, indeed, in the 18th century, the larger one, however, cannot be impressed by the figments of religious imagination, as they would have seen it, and is therefore in need of the theatre. In particular, he claims that theatre is useful to rulers who through it get to see the truth and to know mankind, either of which would be very difficult for them under any other circumstances. And I just skipped the German original quotation. I think you now know my German accent. One can only suppose that the latter point was inspired by the famous mousetrap, the play within the play. Oh no, I actually have to read this because this is, so I will be reading it. Eine merkwürdige Klasse von Menschen hat Ursache, dankbarer als die übrigen gegenüber die Bühne zu sein. Hier nur hören die großen Welt, was sie nie oder selten hören. Wahrheit, was sie nie oder selten sehen, sehen sie hier, den Menschen. One only can suppose that the latter point was inspired by the famous mousetrap, the play within the play, the murder of Gonzago in Shakespeare's Hamlet. Ironically, Schiller considers the truthfulness of the theatre so highly as to claim that of all places, only on stage, quotation, all masks fall and all makeup fades away, end of quotation. Even more ironical is his allusion to the language of sacramental theology when he locates, quote, contemplation and living presence, end quote, in the theatre alone. In comparing religion and theatre, he uses the metaphors of images and paintings of heaven and hell, horrifying images, and again the 1,000 paintings wherein on stage foolishness and wisdom pass by the spectator in a tangible and true manner. Torheit und Weisheit in der 1,000 Gemälden fasslich und wahr an den Menschen vorübergehen. Despite these unmistakable references to the art of painting, and one might wonder to the institutions that happen to keep them, Schiller does not further elaborate on the role of the visual arts in this context. Let's be clear that the dramatist, who throughout his youth had dreamt of becoming a Lutheran priest and continued to be deeply religious throughout his lifetime, does not suggest the theatre as a substitute or surrogate for religion, but he conceives it as a means to strengthen the effect of religion and law, and perhaps most importantly, as a last resort, wherever and whenever religion and law fail to reach the people. Quote, if moral is not taught anymore, where religion has ceased to find any believers, when no law continues to exist, Medea will still make us shiver when she staggers down the palace's staircases, and after the infanticide has just been committed. Healthy horrors will grasp mankind, and silently everyone will be taking comfort from his clear conscience when Lady Macbeth, the appalling sleepwalker, washes her hands and sends all perfumes of Arabia in order to extinguish the ugly smell of murder. End of quote. Those theatrical, or more specifically tragic scenes eventually engage with the average Joe's moral sense, Schiller argues, and again, he metaphorically calls the actions on stage paintings. Diese auf der Schaubühne aufgestellten Gemälde mit der Moral des gemeinen Mannes endlich in eins zusammenfließen. He especially underscores their fine art character when he explicitly, yet metaphorically, invokes a shocking artistic painting to come alive in the beholder's heart. Das ganze abschreckliche Kunstgemälde im Herzen des Menschen. As Schiller contrasts the power of visible representation, for which he praises the theatre, with the dead letter and cold narration of moral and law, it becomes obvious that his own religious tradition is that of Protestant Swabian pietism, with its very limited visual tradition, which he is willing to accept only for the theatre. It also suggests that he was not familiar with and certainly not sympathetic towards the ecclesiastical theatrum sacrum of the Bavarian, let alone Roman Baroque. In Schiller's view, another great advantage of the theater compared to the other two institutions he deals with is the fact that on stage not just man's virtues and vices are enacted in tragedy, but also his foolishness and stupidity in comedy and satire. The latter he supposed to be morally even more effective than the former, since scorn and contempt, in his view, harm people's pride more deeply than loathing tortures their conscience. Spott und Verachtung verwunden den Stolz des Menschen empfindlicher als Verabscheuung sein Gewissen foltert. Since Schiller himself references the visual arts constantly, if metaphorically, in order to express the power and the impact of the theater, in the following paragraphs he even refers to the poet's brush, the Pinsel. Let's expand his reflection to include his metaphorical vehicle and extend his thoughts into our own days, where theater is accompanied by a number of technologically staggered, interconnected media such as cinema, television, and film streaming. And the museum has become a primary force among educational institutions, which also comprise schools, universities, libraries, academies, and foundations of various kinds. Just as a theater, the art museum is characterized by the immediacy of presence of the actors and the performed play in the former instance, and of the original artworks in the latter, which the beholder observes in general without or with very limited interaction, although the museum visit may be hybridized with a lesson through the presence of an educator or a guide, who in general takes on a Virgil-like function of commenting and explaining what is being beheld. Or in some instances, as we just saw in the previous lecture, thanks to current technology. As with theater, but unlike institutions of curricular learning, the museum visit is generally not perceived as a component within a chain of regular events, which form a cycle or may even be open-ended, but rather a single, albeit repeatable event. But unlike schools, there's no structural limitation to the demographics of its audience, such as defined by age groups, educational goals, income, or geography. But just as the theater, and even more so given the limiting factor of the language spoken on stage, it is characterized by a wide and potentially almost unlimited spread of audience. As such, it is uniquely positioned to fulfill Schiller's ideal, formulated for the theater, to become a hub for a universal and holistic culture and education, which goes beyond and counterbalances any specialized knowledge. Quote, "The theater is the institution where joy is paired with instruction, relaxation with exertion, distraction with education, where no force of the soul is stressed to the detriment of another, no pleasure is being enjoyed at the cost of the whole." End of quote. There are at least 7 different areas of opportunity for museums to move beyond its basic conservation and research function and to become agents of moral learning and enlightenment in the sense of Schiller's human civic education or Menschen- und Volksbildung. Number 1, the subject matter and iconography of every single work of art in a museum offers plenty of starting points for an emotional experience and therefore for moral reflection. This is the lead for Alain de Botton's strictly secular, psychological, and ultimately individualistic approach as detailed in Art as Therapy and in his Rijksmuseum labeling project. At the Uffizi, the intercultural storytelling project, which immigrants from so far 16 different countries, Sguardi dal Mondo, led by Maria Grazia Panigada and Simona Bodo and organized by our Accessibility and Cultural Mediation Department, went into a similar direction, but it rooted the emotional experience in the beholder's personal cultural biography in each case, and therefore it was hospitable to the different religious beliefs that inform each person's life as well. And you can consult it on our website, www.uffizi.org. .it, but it's also .org now points to .it. Okay, so, number 2, the museum may itself offer traces of tragedy as starting points of moving experiences and moral reflection. The Uffizi, for instance, was bombed twice. In the night of August the 4th, 1944, when most bridges except for the Ponte Vecchio were destroyed by the retreating army of Nazi Germany, and parts of the Vasari corridor and rooms on the Uffizi's upper floor were destroyed, together with numerous civilian habitations on both sides of the Arno River. And in the early morning hours of May 27th, 1993, by the infamous mafia bomb in Via dei Girgofili, which killed 5 people, including 2 children, apart from ripping apart the medieval tower of the Girgofili and the western part of the Uffizi. These tragic facts and memories are especially powerful in fostering the law and legality, the resistance against Nazi and similar racist ideologies, as well as against organized crime. Needless to say, the memorial function is the primary and principal function of many monuments, which had their very origin in the collective recollection of tragic or terrorist events of the past, such as Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, the Memorial Hall of the Victims of the Nanjing Massacre, or the National September 11th Memorial Museum in New York. And in fact, in our exhibition on Fritz Koenig, we do have several models for such monuments, as well as for the sphere, the sculpture which originally was built to stand behind the twin, in the midst between the twin towers, and then in a second moment only became a memorial and assumed the secondary function. Just as Schiller observed, for pithy scenes in tragic plays, these museums are prone to cause equally shocking and instructing experiences by moving the visitors' hearts and minds. Number 3. Exemplary human beings of the past are often present in museums thanks to portrait paintings and sculpted busts, occasionally even tombs and sarcophagi. They tend to motivate beholders to reflect on their deeds and sufferings and what they mean to the present, whereas the 19th century exaggeration of putting up monuments to even secondary and almost exclusively male figures on every piece of unoccupied urban space, the excessive personality cult of leaders of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century as well, and the commercialization of notoriety in so-called halls of fame in the 21st century should warn us as to whom we actually choose as worthy examples. We should not forget, however, that the concept itself, which flourished in the Renaissance, as well as it did in the Middle Ages as far as saints are concerned, ultimately goes back to Greek and Roman antiquity, and actually Egyptian antiquity, I should say, with Christian Greco present here too. Learning by imitating is undoubtedly one of the most seasoned educational principles known to mankind, and it is common even in the animal world, as any keeper of a dog, a bird, or a horse can testify. For Confucius, it is the easiest. Famous quote, "By 3 methods we may learn wisdom. First, by reflection, which is noblest. Second, by imitation, which is easiest. And third, by experience, which is hardest." The lives and occasionally the deaths of worthy women and men of the past provide moral examples and conundra, but the process of their identification offers deep insights into moral values themselves. Needless to say, the commemoration of exceptional individuals dovetails with that of collective achievement or disaster as treated in the previous paragraph, as I mentioned a few minutes earlier. The Uffizi preserves 6 of the most important portrait cycles and collections of the past: Andrea del Castagno's Uomini e Donne Famose, from Villa Carducci a Legnaia, the Serie Gioviana, which is notable for its wide, open globalism, in fact, in terms of choosing the sitters which are represented. The Serie Aulica of Medici rulers, the portraits included in the grotesque allegories in the upper floor Uffizi corridor, and the artist's self-portraits started by Cardinal Leopoldo de' Medici around 1650 and carried forward to the present day. And eventually, the statues of famous Florentines on the museum's facades on the Uffizi Square. Number 4, almost every museum unites works of art from different regions, ages, countries, and cultures. Museums are therefore ideally suited to teach lessons in humility, tolerance, and peace. Moreover, the presence of these works generally testifies to a history of peaceful, commercial, and diplomatic exchange between diverse cultures, of mutual respect and admiration, and of cultural influence. The teaching of tolerance and understanding of different cultures, including those of our own ancestors who over the past centuries went through substantial changes in their conditions and ways of life, customs and beliefs, resembles Schiller's ideal that the theater should promote the acceptance of religions and sects, and his claim that the stage planted humanity and gentleness in our hearts. Long before Lessing thought that devotion to God in no way depends upon our suppositions about God, and the fight of Emperor Joseph II, the brother of our own Grand Duke Pietro Leopoldo, against the, quote, terrible hydra of sanctimonious hate, end of quote. The reference to Gotthold Ephraim Lessing's Nathan the Wise, which was published in 1779 and first produced on stage in April 1783, that is exactly 1 year before Schiller's lecture, underscores the immediate impact of this play, which by now has become a classic text for religious tolerance. In a way, the ring parable with which Nathan the Wise proposes to symbolize the unity and differences between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity can be seen as the Western equivalent of the Chinese narration of the Three Laughs at Tiger Brook, which emphasizes the harmony between Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism through the fictional encounter of the 5th century Buddhist recluse Hui Yan, the Confucian poet of the field Dao Yuanming, and the Taoist master Lu Shuzhong on Mount Lu in the Jiangxi province in central China. Today's museum, with its stream of visitors from all angles of the planet, has the chance and the responsibility to serve as a hub of global cultural encounter and exchange, of mutual knowledge and understanding. The Uffizi stand out for their rich collections of world art, which is due to the Medicis and subsequently the Habsburg-Lorraine's virtually endless curiosity and open-mindedness, combined with their severe insistence on quality. They include some of the earliest documented works of art from sub-Saharan Africa, a number of carved ivory tusks which arrived in Florence in the 16th century as diplomatic gifts and which were featured in the exhibition on ivory sculpture in the Medici collection in 2012. And some of the most outstanding and largest known Mamluk rugs from the 16th and early 17th century, which were recently featured in the joint exhibitions on Florence and the Islam at the Uffizi and at the Bargello, and on the Montefeltro and the Islamic East in the National Gallery of the Marche in Urbino, and for which, in fact, we had special educational programs with people from Islamic cultures who gave lessons in calligraphy and guided tours for children in not just in Italian and in English, but also in Arab. Number 5, the act of beholding a work of art necessarily slows down the visitor and prompts him to closely observe, to learn, to reflect, and to meditate, and possibly to sublimate. There is an inherent quality to looking at works of art of any kind that may be defined moral in character, as it favors consciousness and concentration by forcing the beholder to step out of mindless routines and flows of unreflected habits and reactivity. Sublimation, by the way, was already dear to Schiller in the wake of Aristotle's catharsis theory of drama. Number 6, beauty in and by itself, and a category nowadays more frequently cited in mathematics, logic, and information sciences rather than in discourses concerning the fine arts, has a moral quality. While the question of what beauty actually is and whether it cannot all be divided from truth finds many different answers in many different works of art, it cannot be denied that wherever beauty is being perceived, in art or in nature, it inspires and deepens feelings associated with moral values such as safety, identity, hope, compassion, love, charity, and affection, enthusiasm and joy. That is Schiller's higher feeling, the höheres Gefühl, which he mentions in the poem The Evening, which you see to your right, and is objective for the theatre to promote general happiness, the Beförderung allgemeiner Glückseligkeit in the theatre considered as a moral institution, which seems to mirror the unalienable right of the pursuit of happiness in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, which you see to the left. And number 7, eventually the works of art collected in museums may point beyond our own world, much in line with the hopes and convictions of many of their original patrons. In fact, they may anchor morality in a transcendental belief system. For the purposes of this paper and the scope of this conference, this point needs to be considered an optional one. Given, however, that the methodology of modern art history fundamentally depends upon the hermeneutics developed over more than 2 millennia by classical philosophy and philology, and refined by medieval theology, it is not an option to ignore or to hide it. According to the famous distich which circulated since the 12th century to explain the quadruple sense of scripture, and which was adapted for the interpretation of secular poetry as early as in Dante's times, litera gesta docet quid credas allegoria, moralis quid agas, quod tendas anagogia. Both the printed and the human-led didactics in today's museums almost exclusively concentrate on the first 2 senses: the literal, who made the work, when, for whom, and under which circumstances, and the allegorical, which since Panofsky is further divided into the iconographical and iconological components, what is shown and why. The need for the third, the moral sense embedded in the works of art, which we keep not just for future generations, but also for our contemporaries, has been amply demonstrated today. But we should not forget about the possibility to read our artworks in the light of the fourth and last, the anagogical supersense as well. This would certainly be in line with Schiller's definition of the theatre as an art that, quote, exerts all forces of the soul, of the mind, and of the heart, end quote, or in other words, which works morally and anagogically, as far as the soul is concerned, as well as intellectually, for the mind, and emotionally, the heart. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eike. As I said originally, I think that the theatre is actually a very good metaphor to use for some of the things we do, but not always in many senses, because we have to be aware, obviously, in a museum is very different than the theatre. It's not a time-based art in the same way. In a theatre, you're sitting and the story passes in front of you. In a museum, the story is installed and we pass in front of the story at our own. And what gives the museum its most wonderful quality is that we can do it backwards, slowly, quickly, stop at one object, jump from one to another, bring our friends to look at something else. The thing about the museum that's so special, and in my opinion makes it so difficult, is the liberty of movement through the story. Imagine a composer that had to write a piece of an oratorio that you could start at any point and play in any direction at any speed, and it would still make sense, because there is still our role of creating the conditions for people to make sense out of their world. That's what we are stewards of. So in a sense, I think that gives us rather than thinking of the play in a literal sense, we should think of it more in the Brechtian sense, which is we have a moral obligation to use the theater to make a better world, which of course Brecht was a supreme proponent of. And in fact, to me, sums up part of our mission, which is to create the conditions for growth, the conditions for individual growth, the conditions not knowing who those people are, but that they grow. As Brecht himself finished the Caucasian chalk circle by saying that we should learn to give children to the motherly, that they are cared for. We should give the wagons to good drivers, that they are driven well. And we should give the valleys to the gardeners, that they bear fruit. And I think that could sum up, in a sense, what we are doing. Or, to conclude this part of the day, I just want to leave with a single philosophical comment by an American philosopher, Nelson Goodman, who said, "What is a museum? A museum is an institution for the prevention of blindness." Time for coffee.